Right now, President Biden is wheels up, heading to Los Angeles to convene and lead the Summit of the Americas. Immigration is a giant topic, but the leaders of Mexico, El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala are not attending. Those snubs stem from the White House decision to exclude the leaders of Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. The White House press secretary saying Monday the Biden administration made that decision because it did not, quote, believe dictators should be invited. Joining me now is the National Security Council Coordinator for Strategic Communications, John Kirby. Admiral Kirby, of course, the former Pentagon press secretary as well, has also served at the State Department. John, it's good to see you. And so the president is wheels up. Migration is one of the key issues. You have a boycott by leaders who take offense. They think the United States was wrong not to invite Cuba, not to invite Venezuela, not to invite Nicaragua. It has become a mess over the invitation list, not a conversation about the substance. Why did that happen?
Well, look, I think the president took a very principled approach here, John. I mean, the whole purpose of the Summit of the Americas is for democracies to gather and to talk about challenges to democracy in the Western Hemisphere, challenges to economic prosperity and to security. So the president felt, and he first president to go since 2015, that it was important that democracies go. And he understands that others have a different view. That's one of the things that's great about democracies, is that we can have those debates and those discussions, and he respects the decisions of some heads of state not to come. But I will remind that more than 25 heads of states are going to go, and 68 delegations. Even some of those countries who are not setting their heads of state are, in fact, sending delegations and government officials to participate in what will be a very robust set of discussions.
So you say this is it's a principled move to stand up for democracy in the region, which adds the question that some say is hypocrisy. You can help me with what you think is the appropriate language. Yesterday, Karine Jean-Pierre, the White House press secretary, said the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is, quote, an important partner. The President of the United States is on the record as calling them a pariah before he was president. Webster defines pariah as one that is despised or rejected, an outcast. How can one who is despised or rejected be an important partner?
The president was responding, of course, to the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, and a killing that this administration has actually moved to put into place accountability measures for Saudi Arabia. But Saudi Arabia is an important partner, and the president believes that. And the president also believes, John, that it's important for him to be willing and able to meet with leaders all across the world, no matter who they are, who they represent, if, in fact, it's going to improve U.S. national security interests. And in this case, the president absolutely believes that's the case. Now, look, we don't have a trip to Saudi Arabia to announce or meetings to speak to specifically, but the Saudi Arabians are key across the region and quite frankly, across the world in terms of helping our national security interests. Look, our pilots have flown with their pilots, striking missiles, striking targets against ISIS. Our sailors in our ships have sailed with their ships in the Red Sea on counterterrorism missions. And it was because of U.S. diplomatic engagement that we were able to get this truce in Yemen in place, which has now been in force for 2 months, saving countless lives. So there's an awful lot to talk with the Saudis about. And the Crown Prince isn't just the Crown Prince. He's also the defense minister of that very important partner.
I get it. I've been in this town a long time, and I get that presidents sometimes have to sit down with bad actors to do important business, even though there are other things you're mad about. But the challenge here is that Joe Biden as a candidate and Joe Biden as a private citizen, and Joe Biden as vice president before had some things to say about the Saudis. But let's listen. This is Joe Biden in 2018. He's a private citizen at a campaign event after the Khashoggi killing, beating up on Donald Trump, saying Donald Trump was coddling the Saudis.
After the cold-blooded murder of a journalist, giving the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia the benefit of the doubt. Look at the example this sets around the world. Forget what it does here. Think of what's around the world. People wonder what has become of us.
And then, John, there's also this from the Democratic Convention in 2020. Same issue.
I'll be a president who will stand with our allies and friends and make it clear to our adversaries the days of cozying up to dictators is over. And I'll always stand for our values of human rights and dignity. I'll work in common purpose for a more secure, peaceful, and prosperous world.
Now, I get it. Again, there's real politics. Ronald Reagan was the crusader against communism who met with Gorbachev, and history benefited from the president doing that. Is this a case, at a minimum, of candidates say things that candidates say things in black and white, presidents have to deal in nuance?
No, I don't think so. Not at all, John. I mean, look, the president was honest at the time after Jamal Khashoggi was killed, and it was his administration, his leadership, where we put accountability measures in. We held the Saudis accountable, parts of their government, for that. But they are an important partner in a region that is absolutely still vital to U.S. national security interests. And so, again, without speaking to a trip that hasn't been announced or a meeting that hasn't been set, I can tell you that the president is going to be completely unafraid to have honest, candid discussions with leaders around the world, those with whom we agree on almost everything, and those where we have differences. That's what leadership's all about, is being able to have those discussions. And that's what a real partnership is. When you can disagree about things and you can have an honest discussion about, say, human rights or civil rights, and still be able to get things done on the national security landscape.
I want to ask you this question because I think it's the reason you're there. I know this is I think your third day at the White House. You're in a new position there at the White House, but you say a meeting that hasn't been scheduled. The president's own staff, anonymously, but before you took this job, was saying the meeting was set. And then the president himself was asked about it publicly and pushed back. Is that part of the problem here, that there seems to be, Joe Biden ran saying, I'm the adult who knows how to run the government. There seems to be a lot of confusion about this within your West Wing.
There's one commander-in-chief, one president, and he gets to determine who he's going to meet with and when he's going to meet with them. Look, Saudi Arabia, again, is an important partner. We're going to spend time with their leadership. We're going to spend time trying to address issues in the region and around the world that intersect with our national security interests. And look, the schedule will work itself out. When we have something to announce, when we have a meeting to talk about, we'll certainly do that.
I want to sneak in one quick question before I let you go, Admiral, about Ukraine. President Zelensky spoke to the German chancellor today. There was a conversation about the Germans said they would do anything they could to help with this global food crisis because the Ukrainian grain is held up. There have been some conversations about, is there some way to use NATO forces or some Western forces to help get those shipments out? Can that be done without coordinating with Russia? Is that a pipe dream or a possibility?
Well, look, I think everybody's focused on this issue of food security and literally the embargo now that Russia has put in place on getting grain and foodstuffs out of Ukraine. It's a conversation that the president's been having with international leaders. All of us are having across the international community about how to do this. And there's lots of different ideas being floated. I don't want to get ahead of decisions that haven't been made yet, but we also have to be mindful that it is a war zone, and the Black Sea is occupied and sailed by Russian Navy warships, and so that's a larger issue that needs to be talked about. No decisions have been made, but I can tell you that everybody here is very, very focused on the potential food crisis here that could be looming by what Russia's doing. Russia's weaponizing food. Mr. Putin is weaponizing food, not just to hurt the people of Ukraine and their economy, but to hurt the rest of Europe as well. And so it's a big focus of a lot of global leaders.
Admiral John Kirby just days into his new position at the White House. Appreciate your time, John. We'll continue the conversation.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.